I'm Bill Brown on behalf of Brookings Mountain West and my colleagues Rob Lang, Alex Nikolich, and Lucy Klinkhammer. Again, thank you for coming. This is our first lecture of the spring semester. We didn't waste any time getting started. 2 weeks from tonight, we'll have our next lecture. Colleague Alan Friedman will be out from Brookings. Alan's an expert in cybersecurity. He may be here sooner than I thought. No. You'll enjoy hearing Alan if you have time to join us. He's working with faculty and students, as is Tom Loveless and our Brookings colleagues. So try and join us on the 31st if you can. Tonight we welcome back Tom Loveless, Senior Fellow in Governance Studies at Brookings and an expert on K through 12 education. That'll be our focus tonight. And is it fair to say, a nation obsessed with testings and rankings and scores? It's an appropriate topic. And I've been reasonably assured there will be no blue books passed out during tonight's lecture. Okay, we're all safe. Tom I don't want to put any pressure on you, but Tom's a great lecturer and wonderful colleague. We met this afternoon with the superintendent of the school district. We'll be meeting with the chancellor of the Nevada System of Higher Education. So this is what Brookings is about, getting in the community and getting to know this place and trying to find some solutions to the challenges that face us. So we've got some expert education students, and that's enough pressure to put on you, Tom. Let me bring a former 6th grade teacher, but a guy with his PhD from Harvard to put all that together for you tonight. Tom?
Thanks. Thanks, Bill. Actually, my PhD is from Chicago, but I taught at Harvard, so that's my affiliation with Harvard. Thank you. It's great to be here. And I was here last year, gave a lecture, and a lot of questions that came up had to do with international education and especially test scores internationally. So I thought, well, that would be a fun topic, and it's something I do a lot of research with. So that's why I came back, and we'll take a look at that tonight. Here's basically an outline of my talk. Oh, by the way, you can interrupt anytime. I did teach 6th grade. I'm used to interruptions. And if your question's going to be answered later, or if I think we're dawdling, I'll move us right along. So I'll apologize right up front if I appear rude. I don't mean to be. Here are the topics that I want to talk about. First of all, I want to describe the first international test, because there's a mythology here in the United States about international tests, and I want to kind of debunk that right off the get-go. Secondly, why these test scores matter. Third, I want to compare PISA and TIMSS. These are the acronyms for the two major tests. PISA stands for the Program in International Student Assessment. I won't use all those words ever again. It'll just be PISA the rest of the talk. And TIMSS stands for the Trends in Mathematics and Science Study, and that's TIMSS. We'll look at some sample items. I will provide the answers to the items, so we won't have to do any heavy lifting. We'll look at some of the latest results from the two tests, and then I want to mention some surprises that are in the data when you compare countries. And one thing that's not on this outline, I'll finish up by considering the question of, so where does Las Vegas and Clark County, if there were an international test and we had a score, what would that look like? And I hope you won't start throwing things at me when I show you that. But anyway, that's the basic idea for the evening. And now I need to figure out the clicker. Okay, the first test, a lot of people have it in their heads that there was this golden era in terms of the United States, that at one time we led the world, and we've fallen either quickly or slowly, depending on your point of view, but that one time we led the world among academic achievement. We were right at the top in test scores, and today we're near the bottom. Well, both those things actually are false. We never led the world. In fact, here's the cover from the very first study. Study was given in mathematics from 1961 to 64. It took 3 years to test just 12 countries. There were 12 nations. The United States, out of the 12, finished 11th. The very first test. We have no international test data before that. So people who say, boy, we used to score at the top, I don't know what they're looking at because there's no such test where we scored at the top. This was published in '67. The tests were given from '61 to '64. Gives you an idea of how long it took. Remember, this is pre-computers, so all the regressions, all the correlations, all the tabulations done by hand. And typically, the way this was done, they'd collect the data, and there were teams of graduate students in basements in universities around the world who sat and just tabulated data, and then they'd aggregate up to the basement level and then start running regressions, again, by hand. So really a very... Torsten Hussein was a famous Swedish investigator. He led the entire project. It still takes a lot of people to do this today, but of course with computers, so much of the stuff is easier. Now here are the results from that first test. So here's population 1B, which are 13-year-olds. These are 8th graders, basically. You see, I rank ordered them. This happens to be the percentage of items that they got right. It's a very difficult test. And here's the US, down in 11th place, as I promised you. Here's poor Sweden in 12th. Here's the international average, 23%. Israel scored at the top, but you see some countries that today score at the top. Japan does very well today. Finland does very well. So when you hear about Finland, they were pretty good 50 years ago. We don't need to get too carried away. Now, why does any of this matter? Here's a study, and I don't want to fully endorse this study, but you have to take it, I think, with a bit of a grain of salt, but not entirely. And it's a study by Rick Hanushek and some of his colleagues, and it looks at two questions. One is, what kids know when they're in high school, does that matter in terms of a country's economic growth when you look out 1, 2, 3, 4 decades? And they looked at 40 years of test scores and basically asked the question, are these test scores related to economic progress? And they used a lag kind of indicator. Now on the left, what they did, this is just a simple dot plot. The left graph answers the question, does how much you know matter? And you can tell that it does a great deal. The countries that score high tend to then have later economic progress. Korea is the greatest example of this. The South Koreans not only started out scoring high, but they've continued to maintain that high ranking and even have grown over the years. And Korea in the 1960s was a very poor country. In fact, it had been devastated by war. So it's not a matter of wealth. It really does show that learning matters. That's the graph on the left. Now the graph on the right is what we call attainment. And what it does is control for learning and say, is it the number of years of attending education that matters? So it's seat time and degrees earned. Economists used to only look at this because they didn't have a lot of data with this. They didn't have good test data. But they did have crude indicators of, like in our census, how many years have you gone to education? How many years of education have you completed? So the right-hand graph, which also shows a positive relationship, but it's not as strong. And the moral of this particular story of these two graphs is it's learning that matters. It's not just going to school or putting your population through school. Does that make sense? Now, let's talk about the two tests, Pisa and TIMSS. And I have quite a bit of information here. I'm going to kind of zip through it, so don't worry about reading any of this. But they differ on a lot of different dimensions. First of all, in terms of governance, the Pisa test was invented really by governments, and frankly, Western European governments. It's a creature of the OECD, which is a European, mostly European-led organization. The US and other developed countries belong. But that's where the Pisa test came from. The Pisa test began in 2000, and it's the ministers of education from the various countries that actually govern the test. The TIMSS test that I showed you, Torsten Hussein, back when it started in the 1960s, that test was created by researchers and government representatives. I, for example, am affiliated with the TIMSS test. I represent the United States in the governance of the TIMSS test. So the TIMSS, and I've never worked for the federal government. So the TIMSS test is a little bit different in terms of how it's governed. The samples are different. The Pisa test is a high school test, age 15. In the US, it's given to typically sophomores in high school, about 2/3 of the sample. But what happens is they go into a school, they randomly sample, they get a list of all the kids who are 15 years old within a year of 15. Then they randomly sample that group. About 2/3 of them turn out to be sophomores, but they could be freshmen. They could be juniors, they could be in other grades. So really important difference between the two tests. TIMSS is a grade-based test. It takes all fourth graders, samples them, and it takes all eighth graders and samples them. The kids are younger, but it's also grade-based, it's not age-based. And there are some consequences for that. The philosophy of the two assessments is quite different. Let's start on the right with TIMSS. The objective of TIMSS is to measure the learning that occurs in schools. So when a TIMSS test is developed, they have representatives from all the countries. I mentioned that I'm from the United States. There's over 60 nations involved. And essentially the test, the validity question is, does this test reflect what's taught in your classrooms? PISA starts from a completely different perspective. PISA says what's really important, especially in the future, what's going to be important is how well you can apply knowledge. And so it tests both learning inside and outside of school, and it measures the ability to apply what has been learned. And there's a rivalry between these two philosophies. This is known as a socio-constructivist view of knowledge, that knowledge is constructed by students, and that it's the application that matters. TIMSS is more of an old-fashioned math test, for example. I'll show you some items in just a second. So here are the PISA topics. Even by looking at the topics, you can tell that they're different tests. PISA's dimensions, what it actually says it tests on, are mathematical literacy, and that means space and shape. They don't use the term geometry, space and shape. Change in relationships, I learned that as algebra. Quantity and uncertainty, I learned uncertainty as probability and statistics, and I learned quantity as meaning arithmetic. Basically, those terms all translate to what I just said, but these are the newer ways of explaining them. So TIMSS and PISA, very different tests. Now here's a sample item, okay? This is from TIMSS, 4th grade. I've given you the answer. Straightforward arithmetic problem, but kind of a neat one. I mean, it has a little twist to it. I'll read it's a little blurry, so I'll read the prompt to you. Mano did the subtraction problem above for homework, but he spilled some of his drink on it. Right there. He doesn't spill big blotches, just tiny little dots. One digit could not be read. His answer of 415 was correct. What is the missing digit? And the answer is 2. Now, I've watched kids do this test, and the way the smart kids do the test is they take 942 and they subtract 415, and they get 527, and they know the missing digit is 2 in the tens place. But you can solve it other ways. You can do a little trial by error. You can say 2, take away 7. Let's see, we have to borrow, and then you draw a line through the 4, and you put a 3 there. And then it's 3 minus blank equals 1, and the answer is 2 also. But the answer is 2 no matter how you figure it. Over here are the results by country. So these are the percentages of kids that answered this question right. International percentage is 42%. And I'm looking for the United States. There it is, just slightly below average, 41%. I'm sure that's not different from 42 in terms of statistical significance. But you see the countries here at the top. These are 4th graders. Chinese Taipei, on this item, the top one, 88% of 4th graders got it right. Hong Kong, 85. Singapore, 85. These 3 countries, we're going to be seeing a lot of them as I go through and look at other test data. And then you can see the countries at the bottom, Qatar, 5%, Yemen, 7%, Kuwait, 10%. Kuwait's a very wealthy country, but scores at the bottom. So again, it's not necessarily wealth. Now here's an item from PISA. PISA, because it deals with 15-year-olds, and like I said, has a particular philosophy, also has a coolness factor that TIMSS does not have. So all the items are supposed to appeal to teens. This is the rock concert item. I will tell you right up front, I hate this item. I don't like it at all. I don't think it's a good math item for a bunch of reasons, and I'll tell you in a minute. But let's solve it. I mean, it's an interesting item. And here it is. For a rock concert, a rectangular field of size 100 meters by 50 meters was reserved for the audience. The concert was completely sold out, and the field was full with all the fans standing. Which one of the following is likely to be the best estimate of the total number of people attending the concert? Now, the way you do the item, the way you calculate this, and the correct answer, by the way, is C. But the way you calculate it, so you first figure the area, and it's 100 times 50, so you get, it's 5,000 meters. 5,000 square meters. And then the question is, well, how many kids standing can fit in a square meter? Now, according to the Pisa people, it's 4. I think that's a little tight for, you know. Now, two of those seats you're sitting in is like, I think about 1 meter wide would be my guess. So 4 standing, yeah, maybe. But now when I first calculated this item, when I first did it, I thought, okay, a square meter, I think 3 people. So I started out at 15,000. And then I started thinking, well, but you need aisles, and there are fire marshals, and the stage will take. So I started subtracting all the kind of things, and my best guess was 10 to 12, not 20,000. So, but the PISA authors believe that math is, you know, we're teaching, not just testing kids, but teaching them that math's kind of a dirty subject, and you know, not all answers are perfect, and well, okay. The things that I think are a little bit troubling about this item is, first of all, it is clearly written for Europeans. Notice the notation. It's in meters. A lot of kids will be thrown off, Americans will be thrown off by this. What's 50 m? They'll think it's an algebra problem. And there's no commas in the thousands place here. So PISA is a good test, but in this idea of applying, sometimes you can run into some problems. Now here's a much more complicated PISA item. This is the internet chat item. You'll notice it has lots of reading, and this is true with PISA items. And I'm not going to go through the whole item. Basically, you have 2 kids in 2 different countries. One's in Australia, the other one is in Germany. One's in Berlin, one's in Sydney. And they chat all the time on the internet, some social network that they're on. And they both, down here, when you get down to this part, they both go to school and they have to sleep. So you have to figure out when can they chat? When will they both be awake and not in school? Now, I'll tell you that I serve on committees with mathematicians. What they dislike about this item is they go, well, this is very clever, but there's no mathematics here. You know, so our 15-year-olds, if we want them studying algebra and geometry, this isn't algebra or geometry. I mean, it's a very clever problem-solving item. But the mathematics, actually, there is a branch of mathematics. I learned it back in the 60s. It's called modular arithmetic, or clock arithmetic. But that's about it. There isn't much other math here. So you wind up calculating when they can chat, and I've forgotten what the right answer to this one is. So. All right, let's look at the scores. Here are the last TIMSS scores. 2007, a TIMSS was given in 2011, but the results aren't out yet. They'll be released in December of this year, 2012. So here's grade 4. In green, I've shaded the countries that scored above, statistically significantly above, the international average, which is 500. Standard deviation is 100. And you can see the countries I mentioned before. Here's Hong Kong right at the top, Singapore, Chinese Taipei, Japan. Kazakhstan really needs to have an asterisk by its name because they didn't follow exactly the rules that you're supposed to follow. And they do have an asterisk by their names in all the publications. And then there's Russia. But you'll notice the gap. You do have some Asian countries here at the top, down to Japan, and then you've got sort of a drop-off. These really are clearly the top-tier countries. Here's the US, scores above average. The TIMSS population is different from the PISA population. You have more developing countries in the TIMSS population. So one of the things you should take away from this talk is when you look at, say, rankings of the United States, we're always going to look better on TIMSS than we do on PISA because we're competing with a lot of countries that don't have fully developed school systems on TIMSS. So the average, the mean is going to be influenced by that. Does that make sense? So you have all the wealthy countries of the world participate in PISA, not so in TIMSS. But nevertheless, we score a little bit above average here. These are 4th graders. Here's the bottom of the distribution just to show you. And Norway's a very wealthy country, but scores below average. Here's the very bottom of the distribution. Here's grade 8. Chinese Taipei, Korea, Singapore, Hong Kong, Japan. Hungary is always, Hungary's always done well on TIMSS tests. and the bottom of the distribution. Lots of countries. As I said, you can see the distribution on TIMS. Lots of developing countries, especially Asia and, excuse me, not Asia, but Africa and the Middle East. A lot of countries now joining. Botswana joined recently. You see at 461. A lot of the Middle Eastern countries, Qatar, Jordan, Kuwait. Now here are the last PISA results. PISA is given every 3 years. I didn't mention TIMS is given every 4 years. So it was given in 2011. The results are not out. PISA is given this year, 2012. It tests in 3 subjects, reading, math, and science. Here is the average here in the middle. So in reading, 493. You can see we score 500, a little bit above average. Here's the average in math, 496. We score a little below average. And the average in science, and we score a little bit above. Not horrible, but mediocre. And that's kind of really what the U.S., the people, even President Obama, he gets it wrong, where he says we score at the bottom. We don't score at the bottom. You're not seeing the U.S. at the bottom of any of these lists. We score kind of in the middle, a mediocre middle.
Question?
Yes?
Do private schools participate in these tests, or are they only public schools?
They're public. Here's Shanghai, China. Shanghai, sometimes you get subunits of countries participating as if they're a country. Shanghai scored at the top in all 3 subjects. Now, Shanghai is a very unique situation. The New York Times, when they published this last batch of PISA scores, they made the mistake, they kept referring to China. This is not China. This is just one city in China, Shanghai. And Shanghai is an elite system within China. It truly is the jewel of the Chinese system. It's a very unique system. But you see Korea, Finland, Hong Kong, again at the top. And similar countries that we saw. So there are countries that take both tests, and similar countries there at the bottom.
I have a question.
Yes?
What's the language of the reading?
It's given in the dominant language of the country. So in the US, it's given in English. But that's up to the national coordinators of each country. There are lots of translations in these tests, and they have committees, both the TIMS and PISA have committees that once a test is translated, it goes through a verification process that the translation doesn't somehow skew the comparability from one country to the next. So the Americans have, I think, a greater doubt about these tests, like, oh, there must be something fishy here. You know, there's no way this could really be accurate. It's really not true. Now, if you go back to the first test, I think there was some non-comparability in terms of the sampling, but these things are policed to death, seriously policed, so it's not like there's, you know, the Russians are cheating, we know. It's not, no, that's really not it. Now, let me take the question, what can we learn? So what can we take away from these tests? I want to look at some trends and then talk about the top scoring nations and then also discuss some surprises. So that first test, here was the headline in the Washington Post. Poor U.S. math showing didn't surprise experts. So we kind of knew back in the 60s, maybe our schools aren't that great. I mean, Sputnik, after all, kind of had awakened us to that possibility in, you know, some years before that, in the late 50s. But the sentence here that I think is interesting is here in the 3rd paragraph, and this is still true today. The experts assert that teachers here are not as well trained and that neither American students nor the society at large places as much value on mathematics achievement as do many countries. And I honestly think that is still true today. Culture matters a great deal with this, and I'm going to show you some stuff in a minute, a study that I did. Now the question is, okay, can we look at this stuff over time across the different tests? And here's something, a chart I put together. So these tests are different, but what I did is I standardized the results. Remember those 12 countries? I just tracked them through over time, and I standardized all the results by computing just what's called a z-score. So I took the mean and established that as 0, and then used the standard deviation, and these negative numbers mean, like the US here, minus 0.35. On that very first test, FIMS is the initials for that, First International Math Study, we scored 0.35 standard deviations below average. Does that make sense? If you remember, Israel was the top country. They scored 0.62 standard deviations above average, and the average being of these 12. So this is one way for us to look at change over time. Here are these same countries in terms of their scores in the last TIMS. Look at the US. We actually improved. So from the FIMS to the last TIMS, we're now scoring about average. And in Pisa, we scored a little bit below average in math. This is 8th grade, 15-year-olds in Pisa, but 8th grade math in these two columns. So the US isn't plummeting. In fact, we've actually improved slightly. Nothing to, I wouldn't hold a parade, but it's not like we're falling off the face of the earth. They're sort of embarrassing scores and they're mediocre, but they're not horrendous. Now here are the gains. Here's a chart where the US actually looks better. These are the gains more recently, from 1995 to 2007. And these are the gains at 8th grade by country. So I've rank ordered them by country. So the country that has grown the most, showed the most growth, is Colombia. It went from 332 to 380, so it's very low in terms of its scores. 47-point gains, the largest gain in that 12-year period. But the US ranks 4th, 16-point gain, and the little asterisks mean that they're all statistically significant for that country. You can see Korea is still gaining 17 points. Other countries like Japan that score very high, here are the scores, actually have slipped. And you see this in the Japanese press. Japan used to have school on Saturday. The reforms in Japan are all to make school a little bit easier, a little more relaxed. In the US, we're going the other way. But a lot of Japanese critics of those reforms say, look, see, we're not as good as we used to be. We're slipping. And Norway and Sweden down here clearly are slipping. They really have been dropping. Norway is a very wealthy country. Here are all the Pisa scores for the US. So again, I mentioned it started in 2000. And you can see, the scores in 2003. When those came out, Governor Bob Wise of West Virginia said, our scores have fallen off a cliff. Now, not really. I mean, okay, we went down 9 points. When they came out in 2009, he didn't say, we've jumped back on the cliff. You know, I mean, look at science. We went up 13 points here, which is more than the drop here. So again, it's easy. You'll hear a lot of politicians especially exaggerate these scores. It's very important to look at scores over time and to put them in context, to put them in proper perspective. Now, these countries at the top again, take a look. I've actually broken these out by statistical significance, and I want to show you, the purpose of this is to show you, I wouldn't look so much at rankings. Rankings can be deceptive. They're not equal interval, for one thing. So here's the color code to this. Here's the US. All the countries you see in white around the US there, we can't say that the United States actually scores any different than those countries based on the standard error of the test. Every test has noise, right? So none of these scores from Hungary down to the Czech Republic are statistically any different than the US's 508. Does that make sense? So the only countries that statistically outscored us are these 5 at the top, and they outscored the whole world. They truly are extraordinary in their math achievement. Again, this is 8th grade math. If I showed you all 4th grade, all of 8th grade reading, all those subjects, we'd be here till 2 in the morning. So I just wanted to pick out one thing to show you here. Here are all the countries that statistically underperform compared to the US. So there are lots of them. So again, having perspective on this, I think, is important. Now, I'll be a little bit speculative. So far, I've just shown you, basically data. Why do the top scoring nations do so well? And I'll just give you my own top 4. The first, culture that I mentioned. There's an emphasis on academic achievement in childhood. One of the benefits that I get working on TIMS a lot and studying Pisa is I travel a lot all over the world. And the cultural emphasis on achievement is just so noticeably different in other countries. Secondly, time. A lot of countries, the higher achieving countries, have a longer day and longer year. Plus, and very importantly, the time outside school, a lot of it is spent on school related activities or intellectual activities. It doesn't have to be homework or anything like that, but just intellectual activities. The third thing, curriculum. The high-scoring nations, especially the Asian countries in math and science, have a very lean, focused, sequential curriculum. You have to know A to know B. You have to know B to know C. You have to know C to know D. Everyone knows it. The teachers know it. The kids know it. The parents know it. And they know what grade A, B, C, and D will be taught. And it's true for all subjects. And that really helps build progress. And then fourth, the teachers are trained in academic disciplines rather than education schools. So they really are experts, and I'm not meaning to put down ed schools. I did all my teacher training in an ed school. But you do have to be trained in a discipline in order to do well on these, in terms of these high-scoring countries. Now, the study that I mentioned that we did, and I thought, you know, an interesting sample, we never talk to kids and have them compare countries. And the reason why, of course, is a lot of kids aren't in the position to be able to do that intelligently. But the one group that is are foreign exchange students. So I called American Field Service, the largest foreign exchange outfit, right? And said, would you give me a list? I told them the study I wanted to do. I want to survey foreign exchange students and ask them to compare American schools to schools abroad. And I'll start by surveying kids who have come to the US and been in a high school for at least a year. And I want to ask them a bunch of questions. And they said, sure. So I randomly sampled, sample of 500. I had about 380 responses, so 76% response rate, great response rate. And I asked them a bunch of questions about comparing schools. That was published, if you want to look it up, it's on our website. It's in 2001, it's called the Brown Center Report on American Education. And then the next year, we surveyed American kids who had gone abroad and asked them the identical questions, right? Exact same set of questions. And here is what we found out. So we asked them about how much time do you spend on schoolwork, and we asked them, do you think US students spend more or less or about the same amount of time on schoolwork as students in other countries? And here's the international students' response. Let's compare by adding up the a little less to the much less, and we'll just call that the less category. So 57% say less in the US. This is among the foreign exchange students. And then the mores are 14 plus 11 to 25%. So about 2 to 1, the kids from abroad go, the American kids spend less time. The American kids basically agree, not as emphatically, but they do agree. 34% say much less, 20% a little less, so 54 to 34, they agree. The results really do match up. American kids who went abroad for a year in high schools go, American kids don't spend as much time in terms of the amount of schoolwork. Asked them, is it easier? Are the schools easier? More difficult or easier? So the kids from abroad, 56% said much easier, 29% a little easier. The American, 85% are saying the American schools are easier than my school back home in Sweden or in Hong Kong or in Chile. And the American kids basically agree, but not as emphatically at all. But they come out majority, 29 plus 27, 56% are in the easier category. But you can see, not as emphatically as over here. Over here it's decisive. I think these next two are actually the most critical. We asked them about what do their peer groups award status? How do they award status? Now there was a famous book, James Coleman, who was a famous sociologist in the 20th century. He wrote a book called The Adolescent Society. And it kind of rocked the United States because it came out in the late 50s, early 60s. Actually, I think it came out in 1960. And in 1960, America was in love with like being young. All the smoking commercials, you know, they had these young people smoking. If you were young, you smoked. If you were young, you were Marlon Brando, and you were cool, and everything was about being young. The Dr. Spock books about raising children were at the top of the list. So youth was very, very important. And Coleman wrote this book in 1960 called The Adolescent Society, and he spent 3 years in high schools interviewing kids. And he said, look, we have a problem, because adolescents, what they value, number 1 is athleticism, 2 is good looks, and there is no number 3. So he looked at just simply status, peer groups. You know, he looked at kids, asked them lots of questions. What really matters in your group? What makes a person popular? Studied to death their web of students. You can do all these sociograms and stuff like that. And he just kept coming up with these same two things. It's good looks and athletics. And academic stuff was a negative factor. It was a negative factor. If you were really good at math, it's like you are a dweeb, you know? Dweeb, dork, whatever. That is simply not true in other countries. It's just not true. We are unique in this regard. So I asked the question, compared to students in other countries, how important is it to your American friends to do well in math? So they're comparing, compared to the students back home. About the same as 41, but let's do the less more thing. So 45% say it's less of the students from abroad, and more, only 14%. So it's about 3 to 1 say it's less. And over here, with the American kids, they basically agree, but not as emphatically. 37% say it's less, and 25% say it's more. This is on mathematical prowess being status. Take a look at sports. And the two samples completely agree, and you only have to look at one slice of the pie. Much more. 67%. It's much more important, say the international students, to be good at sports, and the American students agree. It's much more important to be good at sports in the US than it is abroad. And you know something? It has nothing to do with sports, like kids being sports crazy. If you go to Japan, baseball's like a religion. It's not that they're less into sports. Baseball's a religion, but it has no connection with school. They don't build stadiums or campuses or diamonds or stuff at their high schools. They do at their colleges, but still it's minor. Their school, sports is a community activity that the community supports and the community actually funds and does things with, but you don't have the teams and you don't have rallies and you don't, because the purpose of school is learning, not playing sports. And that's just different from the way Americans created high schools. When we first started them, we had sports right in the middle of them. So there is a consequence to that. All right, and then finally working, which is also another part-time work, for pay. That's a unique characteristic in the United States. Kids abroad do not work. They tend not to work. Now these are kids, our foreign exchange students probably are less likely to have part-time jobs than the population as a whole. We know from other data that 2/3 of American teens have part-time work while they're going to high school at some point during the high school careers. Abroad, it's just very, very unusual. Notice here, the foreign exchange students say they spend 73%, almost 3/4, they don't have any part-time work at all. In the US, that's less than half that say they have no work. And of those who do, more than 35% say they work more than 5 hours a week. That's only an hour a day during a school week, but look at what it is internationally, only 9%. So part-time work is another aspect to American adolescence that's very unique. You don't see it in other countries. Okay, move on to something a little lighter. Now, this is surprising, and it's puzzled people who study tests internationally. There is an inverse correlation between enjoying a subject and scoring high on it at the national level. So when you ask kids, do you like, this happens to be, do you like science? And then they look at the score, and then we take the scores of science. The kids who don't like science score higher than the kids who like it. And it's quite decisive. On a national level. Here's the Netherlands, where no one likes science. But they score, almost 550 or 540 or so. Here's the US, by the way. We're kind of in the middle on both the enjoyment or the liking question and the score. And then Tunisia, where they love science, but they're not sure what gravity really is. Here's one in math. Here's another kind of weird correlation. Confidence. I usually do well in mathematics, 8th grade. And by the way, if you want to find a place where the US always ranks high, it's right here. I did the top 10 here, so we're in 9th place in confidence in 8th grade. We're not in the 9th place in math, but we're in the 9th place in being confident that we know math. So I've ranked ordered the countries by confidence level. Here are the top 10. Here's the average. Here's the bottom 10. And over here in this column, I put their score. And if there's a little check by it, it means they scored in the top 10 countries in math. So take a look. The top 10 confident countries, I usually do well in math. Only 2 score in the top 10 on the test itself of mathematics. But among the countries in the bottom, they lack confidence. I'm no good in math. Tons of high-scoring countries, 9 out of the 10. You know? And it actually makes sense. Sociologists have a term for this. It's called the frog pond effect. And it has to do with croaking frogs is the idea. So if you have a little tiny croak and you're in a pond with a bunch of frogs that have also tiny croaks, you think your croak's pretty darn good. You know? My croak's okay. But if you have a really big croak and you're in a pond with other frogs that have really big croaks as well, you don't realize how big your croak is. And that's what's going on probably here. You know, a lot of kids in Singapore think, these kids in Singapore, this is the top scoring country in the world, but they're only 18% say that they usually do well in math. Because sitting around them every day are kids who do very well in math. Make sense? We see this too with gifted programs. You take a high-achieving 99th percentile kid, take them out of their home school, put them in a classroom with 99th percentile kids, oh boy, their confidence level goes down quickly. They don't think they're so good anymore. So context is important here. Here's more on confidence. So here's comparing Singapore and the US. Again, the statement is I usually do well in mathematics. Here's Singapore. Agree a little, 46. Agree a lot, 18%. US, agree a lot, 39%. But you get the relationship, and this is another important thing about international test scores. You get the relationship that you would think if you look within the countries. Now, I would expect kids who are confident in math are good at math as well. Once you control for the country's culture, you'll see that result. So here's the US and Singapore. Here are the Singapore kids. This bar is the score of the kids in Singapore who are really confident in math. They score 642, right? Here's the next confident group. We're going down in levels of confidence. They score 616, and you notice it just stair steps down. Now here's the US over here. Here's our really confident group. They score the highest among American kids, and they stair step down. But the key kind of interesting thing is the least confident kid in Singapore still outscores the most confident kid. So confidence matters, but context and culture matters. All right, I'm going to end with this. So how does Clark County stack up? And I'm going to show you some data, actually. These aren't my data. And I think you have to take this with a boulder of salt, not just a grain of salt. Jay Greene, who's at the University of Arkansas, he put together this, it's called a global index. And I'll show you the URL. You can look up any school district in the country. And you'll get where Jay is calculated, where this district would score on Pisa compared to the rest of the world. So you can compare to the rest of the world. Now, the way he did this is this, and I'll use Clark County as an example. First, you have a national score, Pisa, or excuse me, you have an international score, Pisa, right? And I've shown you the United States scores about the middle or a little bit less on Pisa. Then you have a national test called the NAEP test where all the states take it. Where does Nevada score? Low, like in the bottom 15 states. Well, when you center that, you say, oh, okay, well, we start with the international score. You start about the 50 in the middle, and then, well, you're in of that group, you're below that. You're in the bottom third of those who score around the middle, right? See where I'm going with this? And then we know that Clark County on the Nevada test scores towards the bottom of Nevada. So you're at the bottom of the bottom of the bottom. And the problem with that is these tests are all different, so when we go across tests and try to interpolate like that, there's lots of error there. Nevertheless, it gives you a ballpark figure. Now here's what they've come up with. Let me first show you the NAEP data. I mentioned you've seen the national data where the US scores. Here's where Nevada scores. This is just a screenshot I did this morning, I think, when I was working with this. This is on the NAEP site, so you can go to nationsreportcard.gov and you can get all the states. You can plug in any state you want. And by the way, one silver lining to the Nevada NAEP scores, and I've done some studies and I controlled for all kinds of demographic change, because people, when you tell them their state, look, your state really, like, you know, if I give a talk in Mississippi, your state really scores bad. They say, well, we have lots of poor kids, we have this and that going on, and that's absolutely true, but we can control for that statistically and look at other factors. When I've done that and looked at Nevada as a state, it has made more progress than the average state. Made progress, but it's still low. But it's coming off a very low baseline, but it is growing faster than the average state. You can kind of see that here, and I'll show it to you. This is 8th grade math. So let's just pick a date. If we go back to 2003, here's Nevada score is in the light blue. The national average is in the dark blue. So you can see Nevada's like 8 points below average. But if you take the last test in 11, 5 points below average. So you see what I'm saying? Nevada's progressed. They're catching up. Nevada's catching up, in a sense, to the national average. So there's a slight silver lining here. Nevertheless, Nevada's score is below average compared to the other states. And so here's Jay Greene's calculation, and this is the website. His calculation is, these are percentile scores, that Clark County in math internationally would score at the 27th percentile, which means 73% of the world outscores Clark County. And in reading, 36th percentile, which means 64% of the world outscores Clark County. And if Clark County were picked up and magically dropped into the middle of Canada, it would even look worse. 19th percentile in math and 26th percentile in reading. And here's the URL if you want to look at that, globalreportcard.org. So let me conclude. Here's the things I hope, you can tell I used to be a teacher. Here are the things I hope you learned today. The 2 international tests, TIMSS and PISA, differ in content, sampling, design, and age of students tested. The US scores near the international average on mathematics tests, mediocre but not awful. The US has never scored at the top on international tests of math and science. And on reading, I didn't talk too much about little kid reading. 4th grade reading, that test is called PEARLS, the Program in International Reading and Literacy test. And we actually score in the top 5 countries on 4th grade reading. So our little kid reading, it slips an 8th. And then 15, you saw, age 15. The US has improved modestly on international tests of math since 1995. National test scores of math are inversely correlated with national indicators of student confidence and enjoyment of the subject. Culture seems to matter a lot in promoting academic achievement. Extrapolations of state to national to international scores are fraught with error, so they do have to be taken with a grain of salt. That said, Clark County almost certainly would score significantly below average on a test of international achievement. May not be 27th percentile, but certainly it wouldn't be any higher than 35th or 40th percentile. It would be significantly below average. So I'm going to stop right there. Thanks. Questions, comments? Yes.
On that confidence issue, have you looked, is there anything about self-esteem in the classroom and emphasis and that kind of thing? Is there anyone who's looked at teaching methods?
In terms of boosting self-esteem, or?
No, if self-esteem masks false confidence?
I still don't quite understand the question. Self-esteem almost can't be untangled from confidence in the research. They're so closely correlated. Now, it can be unpacked into different dimensions. You get different self-esteem indicators if you ask kids, are you good at school, as opposed to are you good at science, or are you good at math, or are you good at...
Okay, well, if people feel that they have a high degree of confidence and they're not in the high category, is there a false self-esteem being taught in that program?
Oh, I see. Okay. We do actually have some research, like where does this come from? What, do we know much about the problem of kids who don't know very much at all, who think they're really good at academic things. And yes, we do have research on that. One of the problems is a lot of educators are just afraid to clue kids in, on, especially for low achieving kids, just to say to them, look, you don't understand this. Things like red penciling items in writing now, and when writing is corrected, are very much out and old-fashioned. So sending negative signals to kids is frowned upon more often today than it was 20, 30, 40 years ago, certainly more than 60 years ago. So that's one problem. We have all kinds of studies of kids in high school where we ask them, are you prepared for college? And they say yes, and then give them a test or even look at their transcript and see the courses they've taken. They're not even ready for 6th grade, let alone college. They've just been given the wrong signals. And so they're being, in a sense, they're being kind of lied to, so their feelings don't get hurt, I think, is part of the motivation. There's no terrible thing going on here. People aren't trying to trick these kids. But families don't get accurate information on just how low some of their children are, and then they think they get misled by that. Hope that answers your question. Yes?
Going back to an earlier question, the fact that private schools aren't included, is there any thought that if the United States has a higher proportion of top students in private schools, that would tend to bias the results at all?
No. The sampling takes place just within public schools, but we also have other data that have looked at private schools, and so it doesn't make any difference, at least for US scores, if you pool in kids at private schools. And private schools have a different role to play in every country. So it's very interesting, like in Japan, private schools are the low status schools, and public schools are the high status schools. If you go to a private school in Japan, especially a private university or college, the great colleges and universities in Japan, and there's only really one that's fantastic, the University of Tokyo, and it's totally publicly supported. If you go to a private university in Japan, it means you're wealthy and stupid. I'm not kidding. It's where rich people send their kids who cannot get into the great universities go. And so private schooling has a different, and in Europe, for example, most European countries have voucher type programs, and they have religious based K through 12 schools. They've always funded religious schools. So the separation of religion from the state is not an issue where it is here. So the private-public demarcation differs from country to country. But we've looked at what would it look like if we just pooled all those kids in. Would it alter these? It doesn't change much. Yes, yes.
How fair is it to compare the United States to something like Singapore, it's just a city, or Shanghai, which is just a city? I mean, doesn't that seem a little, could we just pick our best city and let them go up against everybody else?
They'd lose. Yeah, don't forget Shanghai is just a city, but it's just a city of, I think the metropolitan area is over 20 million. It's bigger than all but a handful of our states in terms of population. But you're right. I mean, there is a part of I don't think Shanghai should be construed to be China, and I said that. But Shanghai is still Shanghai, and it's still producing a lot of wealth for its country, and it is an enormous place. Yes, but they do all kinds of things in Shanghai that we do not do in terms of education. And all kinds of things that affect test scores too. Rural families that move into Shanghai, if the kids score below a certain level, they're asked to move. There are all kinds of things they do to. And it's not, well, right, but it's a different country with different problems, and I'm not saying they're doing that to boost their test scores or anything. It's the first time they ever took the Pisa, and they really could care. In fact, the Chinese reaction to this is they could care less about these tests. They sort of know these kids always do well on tests. If you've ever seen the movie The Last Emperor, the Chinese invented testing, really. The emperors in China used to first hold tests. Tests of really difficult, intellectual, rigorous tests. First at the village level, and then at the provincial level, and it just built up. And then the finalists, some 3,000, I think, no, it was 10,000 finalists, and this is hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years ago, would come to Beijing and be tested. And the emperor would always open up the testing ceremony, and it was like 3 days of testing. And then the highest scores worked for the emperor. So China knows a lot about testing. Yes?
Have additional factors such as curriculum standards, pedagogical styles, attrition, teacher preparedness, those kinds of things been looked at relative to this data?
They are looked at. These data are not good at causes, okay? They're really not good. If you recall in my talk, once I got to how can I explain why the top countries, I said speculation, and that's all it is. Because all of these tests, when you do a test of cross-sectional, you know, like if I gave all of you a test just for how you stand right now in terms of, let's say, your knowledge of American history, it's just a cross-sectional test, and I can't explain. It doesn't tell me why you know what you know and why you don't know what you don't know. And they're not very good at that. And that's probably the error that most pundits make in the newspapers. They always attribute a cause, and it's usually a cause they already favor before the scores even come out. They attribute that to the scores. So yes, the issue like of teacher quality, people are looking at that, people have looked at that, but with cross-sectional data, very difficult to do. With Finland, you see, there have been 3 different major, like Atlantic Magazine, New York Times, articles just in the last few months attributing Finland's high scores to how it trains teachers. Well, I showed you the first international math score did pretty well back in the 60s, and it wasn't training teachers the same way as it is today. I do think teacher training has something to do with why Finland's scoring high, but I don't know that from the data. I just don't. Yes?
Well, I was just, on that topic, I was wondering if you could clarify your speculation that preparation in the discipline is more important than preparation in education.
Yes.
It seemed that you were suggesting that, say, a PhD in mathematics is better preparation for teaching in a public school than education training.
Yeah, I didn't mean it that way. That would be rather extreme. But I do believe that a math major or math minor teaching in high school, not in elementary, not first grade math, but in high school, we do have pretty good evidence that that matters.
And do you think that pedagogical training is also important?
No. I think pedagogical training, and I was trained up one side and down the other. Did my training in the late 70s in California when, I was telling some of the students earlier, when there was actually a surplus of teachers, so they were cooling us out, is the phrase. So it was a year and a half of student teaching I had to do. You know, 3 semesters, tons of pedagogical courses. I don't think it made a hill of beans difference. I don't think, you know why? And it should make a difference, but I'll tell you why. One is, we are not yet at the place with teaching where we have a science of teaching. We're not yet at a place where we have a body of knowledge that says, if you do this, you'll get good results. And it's, you know, the probability is just greatly enhanced. You're going to get good results. And we don't even train teachers that way. We train doctors that way. I mean, they know if they put a tourniquet over here, things, you know, you can tell my medical knowledge. But they do, to a certain, and it doesn't mean doctors know everything. And doctors will say they fly by the seat of their pants a great deal, much more than people realize. But there is a body of knowledge that we do not have in teaching. Engineers have it. They know if you build a bridge a particular way, it's going to fall down. So they don't build them that way. And with teaching, it is so contingent on, first of all, the kids you're dealing with, the subject you're teaching, what day it is, if there's a fire alarm, if a dog, you know, I taught 6th grade. If a dog runs into your classroom, oh God, the day's over. You know, the day's just basically shot. It's like they've never seen a dog before. So yes, it is, but teaching won't reach the level, I don't think, of medicine and law in prestige until we develop, and this takes good research, just a really good body of knowledge about the science of teaching. Doug Lamothe wrote this book called How to Be a Champion Teacher, you know, that was a best-selling book. Lots of teachers love that book, and then a lot of ed school people said, yeah, but there's no evidence supporting any of this, which is true. There's no evidence. He gives like 45 tips on how to be a good teacher. Some of them just seem commonsensical. It's true, there's no evidence supporting any of them. But there's no evidence supporting what the ed schools do either. Very little.
Or the academic discipline training.
Or the academic, well, no, the academic discipline thing, we actually do have pretty good evidence on. And again, that's high school, majors and minors. And I'll tell you roughly what the statistics are. I didn't prepare for this, but roughly, say in high school in foreign countries, take Japan, about 75% of the teachers who teach math will have majored or minored in math in college as undergrads. In the United States, the figure is about 40%. Now, it really gets embarrassing when you get to, say, 8th grade, and we're pushing math down into the middle schools. Our 8th grade teachers, 30 years ago, those schools were called junior highs. And today they're called middle schools. Junior highs were staffed by people with secondary credentials. Today they're staffed by people with elementary credentials. They have not been trained in math. I've surveyed 8th grade math teachers. 25% of them did not have 3 or more math courses as an undergrad. Courses, I'm not talking about majoring or minoring. To take a teacher like that and expect that teacher to teach algebra, which we're expecting in many of the states now, it's just not likely that that's going to happen or be a good situation. I do think in order to teach algebra, you have to know algebra. And we have lots of elementary school teachers who don't know math. You know, my 6th grade was located in elementary school. I made a fortune tutoring my fellow teachers in math to pass it was called the CBEST test, which was 5th grade math. You know, fractions. We just have to get fractions down, people. I'm not kidding. So teaching algebra is just beyond, that's not even in the ballpark. That's what I mean about content knowledge versus, and pedagogy, they could have every pedagogical trick in the world, but if you don't know fractions, you're not going to be able to teach algebra. Another question? Yeah.
I guess my question is sort of related to the last two. So, with this information, with these tests, what are we doing? It just sort of seems like we can compare ourselves to other countries in this large scale sort of way, but like what kind of action steps, what sort of research is being done that is actually going to like benefit the teaching
Right.
in America?
Right. I think it treats us as a nation like what I mentioned earlier about the high school kids who they can't do 4th or 5th grade arithmetic and they think they're ready for college. They're not ready for college. They can't read very well. We have kids matriculating into colleges who say they've never read a novel. They've never written a paper longer than 3 paragraphs, 5 paragraphs. Now, I think those kids are being fooled. The value, I think, of international tests is I think Americans are very capable of fooling themselves, and I think we have, of thinking our schools are really great. And so the one thing it does is awaken us the possibility that they're not so great. It doesn't give us the answers of how to make them greater, but at least it tells us the truth about where we stand. You're right, there's a lot of work to do after learning that, and the tests can't help us with that, not as much as people think. But they can point, you know, a lot of the stuff I've shown you, like I mentioned the time factor. There has been work with that, looking at does time matter? Just simply spending more minutes on mathematics, on literature, on science. That just more minutes of being taught those things typically leads to better outcomes. Yeah.
First off, I've enjoyed your presentation and your hypotheses that you've presented. And I would like to know if you've considered doing any kind of comparison between, within the United States, the educational background of the parents. You brought up the point about how the society's background, the academic influence is important in the high-scoring countries. Mm-hmm. And perhaps there is some sort of correlation between the educational background of the parents as to how it goes into the academic emphasis in the home and how that might relate to our low scores here in Clark County, considering the way that the majority of people here earn income. Good point. And we have tons of evidence. Parental education matters a great deal.
One of the interesting aspects of all the studies of the impact of parental education on student outcomes is what matters most is mom's education, not dad's. So mom's education means both parents' education matter, but mom's education really matters. And it has the biggest impact in terms of correlation with scores. So that definitely has been examined, and you're quite right. But also what matters are habits within the home that transcend. So once you control for parental education, then the question is, there are things that parents do at home that undermine education. A lot of those values things that I pointed out, that they're not coming from schools. Schools would love to have every kid come to school thinking math's the greatest thing in the world. A lot of that's coming from the house and from home. So parental values, and they can be even with very well-educated parents, can undermine their children in terms of their valuing education through, like the part-time work thing. We have a view in the United States that part of being a well-rounded person involves part-time work. And like I said, not only, and I didn't stress this enough, not only is it unusual in other countries not to have your teenagers work, but it's shameful. It's a stigma, actually, because it means you somehow let down your family as a parent by allowing your children to work. And of course, we're light years from that. Yes.
You said that in the United States, or like the test is given in the dominant language of the country.
Yes.
And because the United States has so many different languages, do you think that giving the test in the specific language that the child was brought up with or that they are most fluent with would make a difference?
Well, you know something, there might be exemptions. I'll have to look into that, because I think there might be bilingual components of the test where we may have a Spanish version of Pisa that's given in the US, but it wouldn't be many languages. But I know, and the US isn't the only country, right, with multilingual populations. We're not the only country with immigrant populations. So, I mean, that's one of the interesting things, the nice things about looking at these international data, is that there are a lot of countries that share common problems. They're slightly different in many respects, but I'll have to double check on you're right, because we do know that test scores are influenced by the language match. Other questions? Yeah.
On the website, the Nation's Report Card, you can compare your school district to the national average. Is there a way, because within each school district you will have a fluctuation between each school within that school district, can you compare an individual school to the national average or not?
No, and the nationsreportcard.gov, that's the NAEP. You can't compare school districts. Well, you can't compare school districts, you can compare states. There is a test called the TUDA, it's the Trial Urban District Assessment. There are only 12 cities that take it, Clark County does not take it. So those would be the only district level scores you'll get on that website. The website where you can get the district level scores are that one called the World Report Card, or the second one. Yeah, let me, Jay Greene's, there's a screenshot, Global Report Card. You can compare your district to the state and to the country. You see the tabs here, district versus national, district versus state, and I've tabbed district versus international. All right, well, thank you all again.
Thank you all for joining us. Let me remind you that in about a week, thanks to our colleagues here who are helping record the session and manage from the control room, all our lectures are recorded. They'll be up on our website in about a week, as will the PowerPoint that you saw, so don't get a cramp from writing too much. And we hope to see you on the 31st. We have to stop. Tom will be here to answer a few more questions, but it is a school night, so thank you very much for coming.